Plants are all around us, and many of them are actually remnants of earlier times and earlier peoples. So the plants that we're going to be looking at today are those that were brought across the Pacific Islands by the earliest people to move into remote Oceania. These are the people that are normally called Lapita. This is based upon the pottery, the distinctive pottery that they used, and is named after a site in New Caledonia where Lapita pottery was first found. There's three key concepts that we want to consider today. The first of these is that plants used by the first migrants into remote Oceania were brought with them from their former homes. So the plants that they were using are not primarily those that are found in the islands of remote Oceania, but they're ones that came from elsewheres. Second is that after settling in the Pacific Islands, new plant uses were developed, both for plants that were brought from somewhere else and for plants that were found locally. The third aspect that we want to consider today is that the development of plant uses and technologies parallels the development of unique cultures and languages. And what we mean by this is that much of what contributes to one culture being different from another culture is the differences in their experiences working with parts of the environment, particularly plant environments, and that together with the new intellectual development of technologies in each society helps to build differences between different societies. One of the evidences of distribution of cultures and the history of cultural movement across the Pacific is languages. Within the Pacific region, we have two major groups that we look at. The one that we're mostly interested in are people who speak Austronesian languages. This is one of the largest language families on Earth and includes languages such as Hawaiian, other Polynesian languages, most of the Micronesian languages, and many of the languages that we think of as Melanesian. It also includes Indonesian, Malaysian, and many of the languages of the Philippines. The other group of languages are the non-Austronesian languages, or sometimes these are called Papuan languages, and this includes the languages of Australia, much of New Guinea, and scattered areas in Indonesia and Solomon Islands and Philippines. If we consider the distribution of languages within a particular family, we can see that languages are set up as kind of family trees, if you will. And the branching on these represents languages that have separated over time, probably due to having decreasing levels of communication. So sometimes this could mean that two groups of people were at one time related, spoke the same language, and they've separated over time and one has diverged from the other, or it could mean that they've maintained contact over the years, but through small changes they've at first diverged into different dialects and then subsequently into different languages. Whatever the case is, we end up with a branching pattern, as you can see on this slide, that is relationships amongst languages, and we can think of this almost as a genealogy of languages. The danger here is that this is not necessarily parallel with a genealogy of the people themselves, simply because people can learn languages and people move fairly fluidly. So one mistake that often happens is that people think that the relationship between the different language families and languages themselves is actually a parallel relationship with the genetics of the people, and it's just simply not true. Although there is a fair amount of evidence to support a lot of that being true. So the language family group that we see illustrated here shows Hawaiian at the tip of the family. Next we have the other languages of Eastern Polynesia. So this would include Tahitian, Maori, and other languages of French Polynesia. And what this shows us is that the Hawaiian language is most closely related to the languages of Eastern Polynesia. The next most closely related group of languages is those of Western Polynesia, being Samoan, Tongan, Uvean. The next most closely related languages after that is Rituman. And in fact, if we were to draw a circle around Rituman, the Western Polynesian languages, Eastern Polynesian, and Hawaiian, we would circle all of the languages that we call Polynesian languages, with Rituman being the most ancient of these languages, the earliest one to branch off from the rest. Next up the chain, we reach Fijian, which is considered to be the closest Melanesian language to the Polynesian languages. And beyond Fijian, we would reach the balance of the Melanesian languages, which is a vast number of languages, hundreds of languages spoken throughout Vanuatu, the Solomon Islands, Fiji, New Caledonia, and adjacent parts of Papua New Guinea. Somewhere back up this family tree, we would actually reach the language that would have been spoken by the Lapita potters. And so this would have been the language of the people that first traveled out into remote Oceania. Oftentimes this language is reproduced as a language called Proto-Oceanic. When we look at the kinds of evidence that archaeologists find for the earliest peoples to settle in the islands of remote Oceania, we're of course looking at the pottery, the famous Lapita pottery, and then how that pottery over time changes into a more simple kind of pottery referred to as plainware that doesn't have the designs of the Lapita pottery, and eventually how almost all of the islands of remote Oceania lose the technology of making pottery, and such that at the time of European contact, there's only 2 or 3 cultures in the Western Pacific who still know how to make pottery and are still using it. And just about everybody else seems to have abandoned it. This is really a strange thing. Nobody knows exactly why it happened, but probably if we could figure out the answer to it, it would really help solve a lot of mysteries. There's a lot of mysteries about the Lapita. For instance, we don't even know why they had this pottery. It turns out that you don't usually find the residue of food on this pottery, the implication being that it wasn't used for cooking or for storage of food. If it wasn't used for that, what was it used for? Maybe storage of water or movement of water? Some people have hypothesized that Lapita pottery was used to store bones of dead ancestors, or that it was part of a religious movement. Nobody really knows. But it's a mystery that when it is answered, I think will really enlighten us as to what was going on in the Western Pacific. Other evidences that archaeologists find of early settlers in remote Oceania include fishhooks, stone tools, and different kinds of biological remains. These include seeds, pollen, charcoal, and small fragments of plants, particularly plants that are used by people. It includes fish, bird, dog, pig, and rat bones, and lots of shells of mollusks, because people eat the mollusks and tend to pile them up, and then we end up with a little shell midden that's there for archaeologists to find later. When we consider the kinds of technologies that people brought into the Pacific, we know that the first settlers to come into remote Oceania practiced what's referred to as a maritime Stone Age technology. This means that they did not have metal tools or implements, and that they were using stones for the hard surfaces of most of their tools, but that they used an awful lot of plant materials, wood and other pieces of plants. And these don't tend to survive very well in the archaeological record, so there's a lot of focus on the stones, because the stones tend to survive. When we talk about changes in toolkits, we can look at different technologies as falling along a continuum of ancient technologies, or things that would be shared in common by a range of cultures. We would refer to these as plesiotechnologies. So if you had 3 or 4 cultures and they all used the same kind of technology, let's say it was cooking in an imu, and every culture used it, then you would assume that their ancestral culture used the same technology, and we would call that a plesiotechnology. It's something ancient, something shared in common. It doesn't actually tell us a lot about cultural development or uniqueness. We have another kind of technology, which is an apotechnology. And an apotechnology is something that is unique to one or more cultures that's not held in common by all cultures. So for instance, if we had a group of 4 cultures that we thought were related, and 2 of them used a particular method for fishing that was a unique technology, and the related cultures did not use that, and nor did any of the cultures that are related to the group as a whole use that, we would assume that one of the ancestors of those 2 cultures that used the technology had developed it as a new one and had passed it on to the descendants. And so this would be an apotechnology for those 2 cultures. The study of apotechnologies really helps us to focus on what is really unique about a culture. All too often people think about the things of their own community and think that absolutely everything about their community is unique. Well, it turns out that in most cases this is simply not true. Very, very few things about each of our cultures are unique. We share far more in common with each other than we have differences from each other. However, it's very interesting to be able to focus on the kinds of technologies that each culture has developed and employed that are uniquely their own. And the reason that this is interesting is because the discovery of these technologies and their implementation within a society changes that society and helps to provide the spectrum of cultural variation that we see today. The aspects of technologies that promote change are the different pieces of toolkits. So this includes the tools that people use, it includes the plants that people use, and it includes the sets of ideas or technologies that are used to transform plants, oftentimes transforming them with tools. And so all of these work together to form the technological toolkit of a particular society. Since we know that the Lapita had a maritime Stone Age technology, we're fairly interested in the kinds of tools and technologies that would be important to fishermen and that would contribute to the kinds of settlement patterns that they had. So fishermen probably want to settle in places that are fairly near where they can fish, that have easy access for canoes to get in and out over reefs and the like. And so the settlement patterns that people have in a particular island group or across the Pacific as a whole tells us a lot about the kinds of technologies that were being used and the preferences that people had for where they were living in the environment. So if we think about the Lapita Toolkit, we can ask some questions. What exactly is needed if you're going to go fishing? Do you need to have something to drink while you're out fishing? Do you need to have shade from the sun? Do you need to have something to process your fish? Do you need to be able to mend your nets or mend your hooks while you're there? What are all the things that come together to make it possible for someone to be a successful fisherman? And it turns out that there are a lot of technologies that all come together to make a successful fisherman. Being a fisherman is not a really simple thing. And so the Lapita, as fishermen, can be seen to be very complex. This image illustrates some of the tools that we know to have been used by the Lapita, and the reason we know this is because all of their descendants across Polynesia and Micronesia use these same kinds of tools. So we know that the Lapita must have had fishing gear. They must have used hooks and lines. They must have used a variety of different kinds of nets. They produced a variety of baskets that could be used on board their canoes. And furthermore, they had canoes because we see several different patterns of canoes widely distributed across the Pacific. Some of the plants that are critical to the lifestyle of the Lapita would include plants such as the coconut. Coconuts are useful throughout the tropical Pacific, and throughout everywhere that the Lapita were found there were also coconuts. Probably some of these are coconut varieties that the Lapita brought with them, and some of them could be coconut varieties that were naturally distributed to these places. The difference between these is that the coconuts that were naturally distributed were probably the larger husked nuts that have lots of fibers useful for making fishing line, ropes, etc., whereas the ones that would have been brought by people were ones with large shells and large inner volumes for storage of liquid, and so would have been more useful for drinking and eating the meat of the coconut. In addition, we are fairly confident that the Lapita brought with them a variety of other plants that were useful for making containers. Most important among these is ipu, or lagenaria, that is used for the making of lots of different kinds of containers, not only for holding water and food, but also for holding your fishing line, holding hooks, and keeping other materials partitioned within your canoe. You could probably even keep your bait in these. Another element that would have been important for these early fishermen would be a way to have shade from the sun. So we tend to see that the words that are used for some kind of shade or shelter on a canoe are the same words that are used for either a cloak or a cape for a person. And so these are probably related terms that relate to very ancient technologies that would have been involved in providing shade for a fisherman out on the open ocean. An alternative to needing shade out on the open ocean is to develop technologies for fishing at night. And we have good evidence that the Lapita had the ability to fish at night. Once again, this is because the terminology that's used for many of the night fishing technologies, such as using a torch to fish at night, or using a spear to fish at night with a torch, or the act of fishing at night. Oftentimes these terms are the same across widely divergent cultures, giving us a good indication that this technology was around at the time of the Lapita. And obviously if you fish at night, you don't have to have a shade, but it requires a different way of approaching your fish and dealing with them. When we consider the Lapita, one of the characteristics about them is that we know that they left islands that were their home and went to new islands. They went to places that nobody had ever been to before. This is really an unusual thing in the course of human history. It's probably not very often that peoples have really been able to go to somewhere where nobody else had ever been before. And yet we can feel fairly confident that the Lapita did this, and they did it a lot. They were major explorers of the Western Pacific and distributed themselves throughout just about every island that you could possibly get to. So in addition to thinking about short-term ventures such as fishing, the Lapita were clearly a people who could think about what would be needed if you were going to move for a lifetime to a new place. They could plan for development of a civilization within an island that had never been inhabited before. So they didn't need to go and take advantage of things that were there already. They could plan ahead for what they would need in their new home. And so when you think about what you would need for a trip of a lifetime, you have to think about the kinds of foods that you're going to want to have, both plants and animals. You have to think about the kinds of containers you're going to need for both shipping these there and for storage of foods when you are already in a new location. You need to think about the kinds of wrappings that would be used. So if you're moving plant propagules from one island to the next, how are you going to protect them from salt water and from sunlight and from other things on board? You know, if you have a pig with you, how are you going to keep it from eating all your food? You have to think about storage. And this is not just storage on your canoe voyage to your new home, but it's also storage for items once you get to your new home. So this would mean you would need to bring some containers for things that you haven't even acquired yet. You know you're going to need to collect new kinds of foods, new animal resources, whatever it is, and so you need to bring some containers to store those things in, or at least bring the technology to know how to make containers to store things. You have a whole range of technologies that you bring with you, and these are all tucked away in different people's heads. We don't know how stratified Lapita society was. It's possible that virtually everybody in the society knew of the same kinds of technologies and had roughly the same skill set. However, it's highly likely that there was some specialization, with some people being farmers, other people being fishermen, some being carpenters, some being healers, some being leaders, some being religious leaders. Lots of possibilities. We don't know, but it's likely that there was variation. And if there was variation, then it might have been important to take that into account. and put those kinds of people on your canoe so that when you got to your new home, you had a full set of the possible technologies from your parent culture. People would have to think about the kinds of medicines they wanted to take along, and this would include both medicines that you had prepared and were going to be using on your voyage, and also the seeds or cuttings of plants that would be used as medicines later on. So you have to kind of plan ahead for problems that could happen. The people's worldview or religion actually comes on the canoe. We don't often think about this, but this is actually an integral part of every culture and would have come on the canoe as well. And so the considerations that could come to bear would be everything from making sure that certain religious leaders came with you, or that you had certain documents with you, or that you had certain sacred items with you, or whatever matters would be important to maintain your belief system. And then lastly, a consideration that we can't be sure if people thought about it, but it seems likely that they did, is the issue of genetic diversity. It is highly likely that as the Lapita moved to settle new islands, they actually considered the fact that within a generation, if they were not careful, there would be a single family that would all be related, and there wouldn't be an easy way for people to intermarry with each other. Now we don't know that Lapita had the same incest taboos that many modern cultures do, but taboos of this sort are fairly widespread in human cultures, and so it's likely that they did. And if they did, then they may very well have taken into account the fact that they would need to have some genetic diversity and be able to marry their sons and daughters other than to each other into a wider group. So it may have meant that a colonizing community would consist of several relatively unrelated families, so that this wouldn't be an issue. Alternatively, people would need to maintain contact with their former homes in order to have marriage partners for their children, and there would be exchange of family members over time. This is a list of some of the food plants that were introduced to Hawaii out of this long chain of movements of people into remote Oceania. What's important about this list is not so much that these are plants that arrived in Hawaii. What's important is that these are plants that left near Oceania, probably with the Lapita, and traveled all the way across the long chain of islands, eventually making their way to Hawaii. Secondarily, these plants were not alone. There were a lot of other plants that left near Oceania and did not make it as far as Hawaii. These plants can be seen as being particularly special in that there was a good reason for people to bring them all the way as far as Hawaii. So the first of these, breadfruit, can be seen as a multi-purpose plant. Ulu is one of these plants that's useful particularly in low-lying atolls, has lots and lots of different uses as clothing, as food, as medicine, etc. Coconuts also fit this pattern, that are useful in low-lying atolls and have lots and lots of uses. And these two trees are actually characteristic of a small number of plants that we find scattered all around the world, mostly in the tropics, that are plants that do well in relatively harsh environments and are used by local people to such an extent that the plants are found incorporated within local cosmologies, local mythology, and are oftentimes incorporated within local genealogies. The balance of the plants on this list are mostly small herbaceous plants that are used as foods. Although some of them may be used for things other than foods, food is probably the main reason these are moved. And so this includes kalo, tea, uhi or yams, uala or sweet potatoes, ma'a or bananas, ko or sugarcane, and pia or arrowroot. All of these form the bulk of the food plants that were being eaten by the Lapita as they traveled into remote Oceania. And all of these plants come from the area of near Oceania, and so therefore were moved by people out into remote Oceania. This next list shows a set of food plants that can be looked at as two groups. Together these two form kind of the lesser foods that were moved into Oceania. And there's actually some interesting speculations about this group of plants, with some people saying that these were the earliest plants moved into Oceania, that were foods early on, and that they were supplanted later by the earlier list that I showed that included plants like kalo. So the first of these, ape, is an aroid that's similar to kalo. The second two are yam relatives that are related to uhi. The fourth is hala, or pandanus, and hala is a plant that arguably was naturally distributed around the Pacific Islands, but we find quite a few varieties that clearly were moved by people, particularly varieties that are either thornless or have lots of starch in their fruits. The last plant, ohia'i, or mountain apple, is a plant that's oftentimes found in inland areas, and it's not really that good of a plant for small, low-lying atolls, but is found on higher islands. And so this plant, although it was distributed across the Pacific Islands, is not uniformly distributed like most of the rest of these. This one is largely relegated to higher islands, where it can have wetter areas in which to grow. In addition to moving plants, the Lapita also introduced into remote Oceania a set of animals. And these include dogs, pigs, rats, chicken, and we can be fairly certain lice. The dogs that were moved were kind of a unique dog, and there's not very many places in the Pacific Islands where these ancient dogs still exist. But when you do find them, what you find is a dog that looks like a beagle, and more often than not, they are unable to bark. They may growl a little bit, and they're very interesting to watch. They'll fight with each other sometimes, but they almost never bark. The story that's often given, that may or may not be true, is that there's a tradition in the Pacific Islands of people eating the dogs that bark, because they didn't want noisy dogs. And the idea being that over time, all the dogs that barked were basically eaten, and the dogs that survived were those that didn't bark, and therefore barking was bred out of them. This may or may not be true. The pigs that were distributed were a smaller kind of pig. They tended to be darker and have longer hair, but they were tame. And these pigs did not have the habit really of living out in the forests. In modern times, the introduction of European boars, which are substantially larger and more aggressive, has in many islands completely displaced these ancient pigs, or in other cases they have interbred and produced an intermediate hybrid. And so many of the wild pigs that we see today are either entirely European boars or are a hybrid of the ancient pigs and the European boar. And these pigs do tend to do quite well out in the forests and often go into those forests, but there's good reason to believe that prior to the arrival of Europeans, the domesticated pigs that people were raising were not spending much time out in the forest. And so the kinds of problems that we have from modern pigs are not really the kinds of problems that people were facing back then. The third animal, the rats, are kind of interesting. People have argued over whether these are food or if they're pets or if they're stowaways. It's turning out that it's highly unlikely that these rats are stowaways. Any of you that have spent time on a small canoe know that it would be pretty hard to hide a rat. It's much more likely that these rats were intentionally brought by people, and probably some people were raising them as food, but as with both dogs and pigs that were also brought as food, the rats probably also served as pets. And it's not difficult to imagine a rat serving as a pet for people who were traveling out into the islands. And then lastly, there was a variety of chickens that was brought in the Pacific Islands. These tend to be much smaller. They're not the brightly colored Rhode Island red chickens that we see all over the place now, but they're fairly simply colored bushfowl. And there are still a few parts of the Pacific Islands where some of these are found in isolation. Generally speaking, where introduced chickens the fancier chickens are found. They interbreed, and after a while all you have is the fancy chickens. Just as certain plants and animals were introduced into remote Oceania by early Lapita people, there were also certain kinds of technologies that were introduced and that moved all the way across the Pacific as far as Hawaii. Likewise, there were certain technologies that were introduced that probably didn't move all the way to Hawaii. So some of the technologies that were moved as far as Hawaii include canoe construction and navigation, which was clearly essential in order for people to come as far as Hawaii. The production of cordage, both ropes and string. The making of medicine and physical manipulation to promote health care. Fishing, different kinds of wetland farming, shifting dryland farming, or Swidden agriculture as it's often called, construction of buildings, houses, and so forth, and construction of weapons and the art of warfare. All of these are technologies that clearly came with Lapita people. And the reason we can say this is because we find related technologies and terminologies for these technologies spread across the vast area of descendant populations of the ancient Lapita. And so we can feel fairly confident that all of these were moved and all of these are ancient. Now, that does not mean that the specific details of each of these technologies are all ancient. So for instance, with canoe construction, many islands have unique apotechnologies as far as their canoe construction goes, where one part or another of a canoe appears to be uniquely developed and designed in a particular culture and is not found anywhere else. However, the general category of canoe construction, and these other ones listed, is clearly of ancient origin. The Lapita also introduced concepts of storage and wrapping of plants, and these were spread all the way across to Hawaii. This illustrates some of the plants that are involved in storage and wrapping. So the first of these tea leaves are of course a very important plant for wrapping of foods, particularly foods that are about to be cooked. Ipu can be used for storage of foods. Banana leaves can be used both for storage, for cooking, and for serving foods. Ohe, or bamboo, can be used for storage and cooking and serving of foods. And avapuhi leaves can be used for cooking of foods. So all of these were introduced with a variety of purposes, but one of the key purposes was the processing of foods, the storage of foods, and wrapping of foods. This is a set of medicinal plants that were introduced into remote Oceania and distributed as far as Hawaii. Now, several of these are arguably plants that may have been naturally distributed across the Pacific Islands, but for the moment, let's consider all of these as being Lapita distributed plants, because we know that all of these are clearly introductions into Hawaii, even though they may not be introductions throughout all of Western Polynesia and the Western Pacific. This last list of plants is a set of plants that are commonly found in the beach drift of Pacific Islands. And I want to conclude with this set of plants because each of these is a plant that is, in one reference or another, assigned or considered to be a plant that was moved by ancient people around the Pacific Islands. And yet there's good reason to believe that each of these is a plant that can easily move itself around the Pacific Islands and didn't need people to do it. And the whole point of this is that this is a little controversial, and that there's a lot of people's opinions that are behind the decisions about whether these are moved by people or whether they're moved naturally. For instance, the first one on the list, kukui, is currently listed in Hawaii as an invasive species and as a Polynesian introduction. Now, it's possible that it is both of those things, and that ancient Polynesians brought it here from the South Pacific, and that now it functions as an invasive species in the mountains. However, it's also possible that this is a species that was naturally distributed to Hawaii, and therefore is a part of the natural flora of the islands, and is not an invasive species, but is simply a successful native species. This is a big argument, and it's one that's very difficult and very heated. Each of these fits into this category where some people claim it to be a native species, while others consider it to be an invasive species. And yet, each of these is a plant that was clearly very important and useful to peoples in the past. So, we've illustrated that plants are used by the first migrants to move out into remote Oceania, and that these were the Lapita people, and that they brought plants with them from their former homes to use for a lot of purposes. The Lapita who moved out into remote Oceania settled a new set of islands that had not seen people before. They brought with them lots of plants and animals and ideas and ways of seeing the world. They transformed the landscapes around them, creating homes for themselves and establishing a wide range of plants and animals that had not been present in those islands before. It's fascinating to look around the environment around us and consider how many of the plants and animals that we see on a daily basis, or even sporadically, were moved by an ancient people from one place to another. How many of these are descendants of plants and animals that helped somebody in the past to survive, maybe one of your ancestors to survive? How many of these plants that are all around us not only shape our lives today, but also shaped the development of cultures in the distant past?